Hello, everyone. My name is David Fulford, and I'm the CEO here at IPAC, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This is a session on Indigenous ownership inside the powerful new partnerships, reshaping Canada's major project landscape, a partnership between IPAC and the Conference Board of Canada. We're going to hear about their research in just a few minutes. With all of our sessions, we like to know where people are participating from and what organizations. So if you could just take a moment and add into the chat feature and let us know the location you're in and what organization you're also participating from, that would be very helpful. Now, I do want to say that IPAC is thrilled to be partnering with the Conference Board of Canada. In a moment, I'll have a chance to introduce Susan Black, who's the CEO. We're really excited about this particular topic, more on that as we go. And also in the future, you'll see a summary of this, which will appear in our newsletter in the month of June. So stay tuned for that. I do want to start by doing a land acknowledgement. And IPAC's office is formally situated on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. This meeting place is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. With participants joining us today virtually from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the lands of all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We hope that everyone will take an opportunity to learn about and acknowledge the land on which you work and live. Now, throughout this session, we really want it to be interactive. So I would ask that when you have questions, if you could please put them into the Q&A feature, and then we'll try and get to them. So please give us your comments and your questions. We really do want to hear from you over the next 55 minutes. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Susan Black. Susan is the CEO of the Conference Board of Canada, and we're thrilled to be partnering with Susan and her team. Susan, over to you.
Well, thank you, David, and welcome everyone. I am thrilled to be here today and to welcome my colleague, Matthew Beliveau, and two of our Research Advisory Board members, Terry Goodtrack, who is CEO of AFOA, and Stephen Liddington, who is VP in Infrastructure Advisory Colliers Project Leaders. So welcome to both of you. For those of you who are not familiar with the Conference Board of Canada, a bit of background. We are Canada's foremost independent applied research organization. For close to 70 years now, we have been providing Canadians with research that supports evidence-based decision-making, decisions that shape a stronger future for our country. With more than 400 research outputs a year and 16 executive councils, we at the Conference Board are passionate about providing evidence, the kind of evidence you need to make informed decisions. Our organization explores important issues ranging from economics to immigration, the world of work to emerging and important skills trends, from the state of innovation, healthcare, and sustainability in Canada to issues confronting our Indigenous and Northern communities, which brings us to you today. Today's session is titled Indigenous Ownership Inside the Powerful New Partnerships, Reshaping Canada's Major Project Landscape. It's a long title, but an important one. As equity co-owners, Indigenous communities can form deep partnerships with industry and pursue greater decision-making powers and opportunities for long-term stable revenue generation. And as we'll hear today, this stands to benefit all actors involved in major projects. The Conference Board is committed to researching critical issues related to reconciliation. And the research we'll be discussing today was produced by the Conference Board's Centre for the North. And that is our collaborative cross-sectoral research center dedicated to supporting reconciliation and Northern socioeconomic development. The center is an example of the Conference Board's commitment to addressing Canada's biggest challenges and opportunities through collective action and a nonpartisan, inclusive, evidence-based approach to research. Since 2009, the Centre for the North has produced over 50 reports, publications, and commentaries that have focused on issues that are of pivotal importance to Indigenous peoples and to Canada's northern and remote regions. It has accomplished this with the support of its members, a host of Indigenous, private, public, not-for-profit, and academic organizations. So a big thanks to the Center and its members for producing what we will be discussing here today. A series of reports related to Indigenous ownership. Now, this series is focused on three things. Number one, the challenges Indigenous communities face acquiring equity in major projects. Number two, best practices that industry, governments, and lenders can use to support this pursuit. And finally, the implications that rising ownership levels could have for Indigenous self-determination. So today, we're going to share a sneak peek at the final installment in our Indigenous Ownership Research Series. So now, without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to my colleague, Matthew. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm just going to share my screen here. So good afternoon, everyone. My name again is Matt Beliveau. I'm a senior research associate with the Conference Board. And the research we're going to be discussing today looks into the topic of Indigenous equity participation. And it's a trend towards First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities taking ownership stakes in economic development projects that are impacting their territories. And so for this research project, we interviewed 38 organizations to get a better understanding of the space. This included organizations like Indigenous development corporations and communities, industry associations, lenders, law firms, consultants, resource development companies, and not-for-profit organizations. And as Susan mentioned, there's three parts to this series. The first two are already published and they're up on our website. They're free to download. I'm going to be skimming over a lot of the detail from those reports today, but I'd encourage you to go check them out on our website. And so with this project, we're looking specifically at major projects, and those can have costs from tens of millions up into billions of dollars. And just to give you an idea of the types of projects that we're talking about, this map up here is from NRCan's major projects inventory. These are all the clean energy projects planned over the next 10 years. And the dark colors are under construction. The lighter colored triangles are in the planning phase. And so these include hydro, wind, solar, biomass, nuclear, geothermal, tidal energy generation, and related transmission lines. And so RBC estimates in a recent report that we'd need to invest about $2 trillion to reach net zero. So about 20 times the amount of projects that we have up on the screen here. We're also looking at major oil and gas projects, which could include oil sands, offshore, natural gas, LNG export terminals, storage facilities, and pipelines. There are hundreds of Indigenous communities involved in ownership discussions on the TMX pipeline. And there are projects like the 3 billion Cedar liquefied natural gas facility. That's the largest First Nations owned infrastructure project in the country. We're also looking at mining projects. There's already 500, over 500 impact and benefit agreements in place between Indigenous communities and mining companies. And we've heard that equity is becoming a very common request in IBA negotiations now. And on this map too, this also includes critical mineral projects, about 56 billion currently planned or under construction right now. And so what do Indigenous groups need to participate as strong equity-based partners in major projects? Early engagement is very important. A lot of mistrust has been generated from poorly planned major projects. And now a majority of Indigenous communities in Canada are located near a contaminated site that was generated by a project approved without their consent. And over half of First Nations reserves across Canada are currently at high risk of experiencing a pipeline spill. So communities are wary of proponents that are pitching projects with overhyped benefits and undisclosed impacts, and they're looking for partners they can trust. And the trend that's happening now is a movement towards a more early engagement and even project co-design alongside Indigenous communities. And this is generating benefits for industry as well, including reduced regulatory risk, accelerated permit approvals, better long-term alignment of interests with Indigenous communities, and incorporation of Indigenous knowledge into project decisions, things like long-term observations of the local environment that can help uncover factors that would otherwise be missed in the project planning. And so in some cases, these new trust-based relationships are forming repeat partnerships and ideation of new projects. Uh, Building capacity is also critical. There's extensive financial and legal due diligence around the business case for major projects, and Indigenous communities and nations need resources that allow their members to be informed and proactive about these decisions. Access to capital is another key barrier, particularly so for remote communities with low revenues. And there's a need for communities to access capital at competitive rates. So they're not just eating up their return on investment with interest paid to acquire that equity. The Indian Act is also frustrating access to capital. And we've heard that the workarounds for this, the corporate structures that need to be in place, can add years in delays, and it can add millions in upfront costs for Indigenous communities looking to get involved in a project. And then there's regulatory certainty. We've heard from communities and outside investors that they've hesitated to get involved in projects because they're unclear about what the full financial impacts will be for the community. And there's a need at the federal level to clarify how are the returns to a community going to be taxed, and are they going to be clawed back out of other federal funds that are owed to communities? That had been a long-standing practice, and it's distorted the returns that come back to communities, and it has discouraged some from getting involved in projects. But there are some leading practices that are helping overcome some of these barriers. Capacity funding is really key. This is enabling access to independent advice for communities so that they're not relying on the proponent's own projections that might be overly optimistic or geared to gain their approval. And so capacity funding currently comes through a patchwork of supports. Some might come from the industry proponent, some from Indigenous Services Canada, some might come from provincial organizations like the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. And there are national collaboration efforts that are making a difference, like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. This was often cited by participants as a best practice. They're bringing many communities together to form standards for proponents to set higher standards for projects and improve communication channels at the same time. But capacity funding is often not available early enough in the project lifecycle to be effective. And that's because communities need often years in advance to plan around maximizing local benefits and ensuring that community members know what the opportunities are coming up and what those opportunities are going to mean for their careers beyond that project as well. Loan guarantees are another best practice. These are a way to backstop loans that communities are taking out to acquire equity. And they're a key way for a government to share risk with Indigenous communities. It's essentially swapping out the government's credit rating for that of the Indigenous partner. And it entices lenders and others to provide financing, and it can lower the cost of the capital provided and make more projects feasible. But right now, those are guarantees are only offered through a patchwork of regional programs. There's a loan guarantee program in Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, but otherwise they are hard to come by. Although in the United States, they are taking a national approach with this through the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program. And last year, that program's funding was increased from $2 billion to $20 billion. And most, if not all, of the application fees were removed as well to drive more uptake for that program. Bridge financing is also a key support that's often lacking. Bridge financing is used at the pre-construction phase when lenders and guarantee providers are less likely to get involved. This is when cost overruns and delays in the project are most likely to occur. The First Nations Finance Authority does fill this gap for participating First Nations, but there's right now no comparable institutions that serve Inuit and Métis communities at this scale. There are Aboriginal financial institutions all over the country. Many of those don't go beyond a 1 million limit in financing. Whereas the gaps around financing equity can get up into the $10 to $20 million range and beyond. So another way that these barriers are being overcome are through creative transaction structures and credit enhancements from industry. And so these can take different forms, such as providing communities with options to purchase shares after a project's already generating revenue. It could be structuring agreements so that industry partners are taking on more of those pre-construction risks or other risks that they're the party better placed to manage. It could mean breaking out lower risk revenue generating assets from a larger project and facilitating ownership of those. So it could be a community taking ownership of a water supply or a power supply to a mine. And then they've got that asset, it generates revenue. It could be used for other projects beyond the first that it was constructed for. And also, communities are not typically majority owners of a major project when they're taking a stake, but many are also negotiating decision-making powers that would normally be reserved for a majority shareholder, particularly when those decision-making powers relate to the environment. So sometimes a different share of classes is class of shares rather is used to separate out Indigenous owners and give them those enhanced decision-making powers. Equity co-investment is another best practice. Some Indigenous communities have pursued partnerships with pension funds, venture capital, and private equity firms, even angel investors to finance ownership of major projects. And they're filling in gaps when banks and other lenders cannot. However, many investors in this space, they lack experience working with Indigenous communities, and they are very sensitive to regulatory uncertainty, ambiguity, and that can keep them away from projects. And there's also the federal government's investment attraction initiatives like the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative, the Venture Capital Action Plan. We heard from private equity participants that these programs aren't really geared to incentivize Indigenous partnerships in any way, and that's a missed opportunity. And finally, this final piece that's coming out next month is looking at this connection between self-determination and equity ownership. And really, the primary connection is that major project ownership has potential to generate long-term stable revenues that can in turn further efforts towards financial independence from other levels of government. And communities are using these revenues from major projects alongside other own source revenues to reach that goal. So it could be combined with returns from settlement trusts, from property or sales taxes, as well as profits from other community-owned ventures. And equity is in some cases replacing fixed payments, which are the most common way that communities seek revenue, a portion of revenues from mining projects. The downside to fixed payments, even though they're very predictable, is that they don't rise with the profits of the projects. So they don't allow for that kind of participation in the risks and rewards in the same way. And so equity allows for that, and it creates new opportunities. Equity is also a way that communities are enhancing their decision-making powers compared to having an IBA agreement where you have a company that's agreed to do certain things. They will report back to the community, and then the community is trying to get those commitments enforced. Whereas with equity, a community could potentially have a member placed on the board of directors for the project. And we heard from participants that they like that the streamlined approach of being able to identify a challenge or an opportunity and to just direct the company to go and take action right away. And they're not having to wait and get reports back from the company first. Major project ownership is also opening up opportunities for transferable capacity development in things like law, finance, management, skilled trades, and other fields that are also supporting implementation of self-government and reacquiring control over public service delivery and economic development in Indigenous communities. And so there are some good examples out there, like Supercom Industries. That's a Indigenous-led training initiative that's leading the way. It was a partnership that was set up for the East-West transmission line project in Ontario, and the organization blew past their recruitment and employment targets, and they did it with a door-to-door community engagement plan that really treated each person as an individual, that looked beyond the project itself and how these opportunities are going to feed into that person's career, and set them up with transferable capacity. This is happening in other ways as well, even through the negotiations themselves. We heard that that's an excellent opportunity to develop the skills in law and finance, and carrying that over into self-government and fueling those efforts as well. So this is all that I have for my presentation today. As mentioned, I've skimmed over a lot of detail. We have a couple of advisory board members here who are very knowledgeable as well. So I'm very eager to hear any questions from the audience, and really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, Terry or Stephen, do you want to jump in and add some commentary at this point?
Sure. So the first thing is I'm sitting here in Ottawa, so I'm on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, so I certainly wanted to recognize that. It's where I currently work and make my home life. It's here in this area. I think, first of all, I'd just like to give a good acknowledgement of the Conference Board of Canada and a number of their research activities that they've been undertaking. This one was I think a really good one to do as well. And I think when you look at the takeaways from this research, the thing that really resonated with me is the part about the link between self-determination and financial independence. And I think this move to more equity ownership in these major projects allows for that to happen. That communities can have the economic freedom to make their choices on improving those socioeconomic outcomes. So I think that's really to me at a broader scale a big takeaway. And I think the other piece that's within that is it certainly allows for Indigenous communities to assert their rights, Indigenous rights, and to ensure that the project aligns with their values, the values of that community and their belief systems on going forward, and how that project can be co-designed. So to me, I think that was a really big takeaway. I think the second one, because I work at AFOA Canada, which we're almost in our 25th year of existence here next year. And this idea of transferable capacity, I think, really resonated again with me because, you know, it allows for knowledge and skills to be transferred, you know, between a major project to an Indigenous community, for an Indigenous government, and vice versa. And I think it really, you know, will help sort of improve sort of the skill sets. I think, you know, with EFA Canada, we initially started out with financial professionals and moved to management and governance professionals, but in terms of certifying. But I think what it, you know, this sort of allows for is to move our financial professionals from what I call the back room, where they're not really seen, to the front room as being very strategic partners in undertaking these major projects and providing advice and strategic advice in particular to that. So to me, those were two of the biggest takeaways that I from the project that I really resonated with me. So turn over to Stephen.
Super. Stephen?
Thanks. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, David. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm traveling today, but my home is also in Ottawa, the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'm pleased to make that recognition and appreciate living there. I'm really pleased with the outcome of this analysis and this report that was done by the Conference Board of Canada. It's timely, it's relevant, it's germane to improving outcomes for Indigenous people, and in the current environment of pursuing reconciliation in its different forms. This is demonstrative of how many communities are benefiting right now from a form of economic reconciliation. And what I've found practically, just as a slight intro to my background, I spend an awful lot of time working on Indigenous equity participation agreements and Indigenous inclusion in major projects, to the effect of many billions of dollars of pipeline of projects at the current moment nationally. The unlocking events that are helping to transform the space and bring economic rewards to impacted communities is by understanding the commercial approaches and the commercial structures and the financial opportunities that are available that really push beyond the simple policy drivers that are noted and accepted or respected across Canada. There is a lot that we have advanced on in terms of developing or accepting UNDRIP, particularly in British Columbia, and more nationally, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. But those are very good leading indicators. And what we're talking about here in this report and what we're establishing in precedent transactions nationally is really an opportunity to include Indigenous communities in decision making of major projects. And Matt showed that the natural resource projects that are coming across the country, hundreds of billions of dollars in development in the next 10 years or so. And so, by early and often inclusion, there is ownership through development. Indigenous communities are sharing in these projects and the decision-making of these projects, identifying Indigenous perspectives that can help move projects forward in meaningful ways that respect their values. And improving outcomes is really what we're sort of looking to achieve here across the board. We'll get better projects, we'll get more of them, and we'll have Indigenous communities, and as an important distinction, not just individuals from Indigenous communities who happen to have businesses set up who can bend in and be that labor support, but truly individual communities being lifted up by these equity agreements and long-term benefits. So I yeah, thrilled to be a part of this, supporting this analysis, and think it's something that we're really at a precipice of a major change, and happy to be on the right side of it. I think this is a great opportunity for us to get together and have that conversation.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Stephen. I would just encourage everyone to please put your questions into the Q&A function, and I'll get to them. I've got a few questions I was going to start with here, and a couple of people have actually emailed me questions, but please use the chat feature because I'm not checking my email. So in the development of your business case, could you speak on how the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People can be leveraged as a policy framework to ensure Indigenous ownership is rooted in advancing economic self-determination for long-term community wealth creation? Who would like to start with that?
I'll jump on that one. So I think there's a couple of ways, really, directly that UNDRIP could be shaping the path ahead. We talk a little bit in the second piece about the Equator Principles, and those are an ESG framework that applies to banks that are financing major projects. And so they were recently revised a couple of years ago now, but the revisions took place as a result of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests back about 10 years ago. And they're an attempt to reform the way that that banks finance these projects, and encouraging banks to request an FPIC process from proponents that are seeking financing. And so further efforts to align the financing standards of banks with UNDRIP could definitely improve conditions for equity ownership. And there's also another development or policy development that's underway around the CSA's National Instrument 43-101. It's the standards of disclosure for mineral projects. And so the First Nations Financial Management Board just put out a good piece on this a few months back, around the fact that Indigenous people are not mentioned in these disclosure standards at all. And so if that was if those standards were more aligned, they would also compel companies to show, do you have free, prior, informed consent from this community? Do you even have a process that you're using to work towards that? That's really in my mind, one of the first steps to kind of advancing things further is getting clear standards around what's an FPIC process that is acceptable and even comparable across companies. Ownership is a good metric in the sense that you can compare ownership levels across projects, and some Indigenous groups have pointed that out, that lenders could be using ownership as a quantitative metric to show which companies should be getting financing and which shouldn't. So there's opportunities there, but yeah, in short, UNDRIP could influence a few of those transparency standards, and push the needle forward that way.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Terry or Stephen, do you want to jump in on that?
I might weigh in quickly as from a practitioner perspective. UNDRIP is adopted in British Columbia, and only really British Columbia at the moment is having some measure of what it means to have free, prior, and informed consent, which is somewhat of a subjective term in nature of how that consent is achieved is still at play. So although UNDRIP is adopted, it's not entirely institutionalized at the moment to have this clarity around what consent really means. Now, one of the points that Matthew touched on, and I'll be a little bit more blunt about it, is that ownership is consent. If there's this inclusion in this ownership option, you're equity partners in this, and there is that investment, and you do have this active support for the project to proceed, because there is this ownership function, and there's governance rights, and there's, you know, decision-making authorities. That's more of a strong form of consent, rather than a proponent saying, you know, having a trail of emails saying that, and we reached consent at some point. So it's still subjective. I think that it does need to be institutionalized. It's a very, very helpful tool, but there is still a fair degree of subjectivity around it, which sometimes makes it challenging.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think Matthew and Stephen, you know, discussed the epic part, but to me, when I think of UNDRIP, I like my earlier comments, the self-determination part, because, you know, it's about, to me, autonomous decision making, and it's the community's choice to move into these type of projects, right? And the type of project that they want to move into, whether that be equity ownership, some type of co-partnership in this. So it comes down to me to the self-determination part, which is how it becomes an autonomous choice, is what it is.
Super. Okay, another question. What role do existing organizations, First Nation Tax Commission, First Nation Infrastructure Institute, have in equity ownership? In your opinion, do these organizations fill the gaps and address the financial needs of Indigenous communities towards equity ownership? Who'd like to start? Matthew.
On that, I'll just mention we found they were filling gaps for members in a lot of cases. One big gap here is that Inuit and Métis communities don't have comparable institutions that are focused in the same way on equity ownership, or on building finance and management capacity more generally. So having a distinction-based approach from the federal government, making sure that those similar financing options are actually out there and available to Inuit and Métis communities, that is a gap that we found in the research. Absolutely.
I think every one of those institutions that you mentioned have a particular role, right? In equity ownership, whether that be the Finance Authority, the Tax Commission, or the First Nation Financial Management Board. But as well, there's, you know, one that's not mentioned is AFWay Canada, right? So I'll talk about that a little bit. So and it gives me an opportunity to do a bit of a plug here. You know, we do certifications, right? And as I mentioned earlier, of management, finance, governance certifications, and we align it with broader ones. So a more recent one that we were just embarking upon for all the three different groups that you talked about, whether it be the Inuit, the Métis, or First Nations, we're embarking on a project financing certification. And that's for major projects. It's for infrastructure projects that communities wish to move into. And I think what it does is it certainly builds capacity in this specific area that's much needed. It helps reduce the risk, to me, of these projects, because you have people now going through that have knowledge and skills of the entire life cycle of the project. It increases the confidence and capability of individuals on that they can actually undertake these type of projects. And I think it certainly you know, outlines the life cycle of this, but incorporated within the certification is Indigenous values and beliefs, because otherwise, you know, all of our certifications, we want to make sure that that's a key component within the environment of that particular community. So I think, you know, the certification itself in AFWay Canada certainly also contributes to the major projects as well.
Thanks, Terry. Stephen, anything you want to add?
Briefly, yeah, I think there's a yes or no part of that question, and whether or not these institutions fill the gap, and they do not. You know, they can be parts of a puzzle that contribute towards solutions, but they're ready to sort of assist when there's a baked deal, particularly the FNFA, which some communities qualify for or can meet their standard of membership and many others cannot. But they're not along the ride of project development and all the capacity building and the requirements during that development phase, which can honestly, you know, really push most communities out of contention for project partnership because they can't necessarily align themselves and have a commercial structure developed and a plan to be a good counterparty in the transaction and be able to have a shot at raising capital for these projects to come together. So many are left behind before they can even have really a chance to start. And I think that's where, you know, many other government programs and granting and funding organizations and not-for-profits like AFOA and the First Nations Major Projects Coalition do come into play to help move projects along and get to a point where there is a reasonable commercial structure for these communities to participate, and then these institutions may be able to lend and assist in that regard.
Super. And yes, just to let everyone know, a video of today's event and the materials will be shared. Here's another question. In the context of building a trust-based relationship, could you speak to the strategic importance of the Extractive Sector Transparency Measure Act for an enhanced process of transparency to strengthen stakeholder relations in accordance with best Canadian mining governance practices? Who would like to start with that?
Yeah, I'll jump in again. So we do look at ESMA in the third piece that hasn't been published yet. And there's some good research from the lawyers at Castles. They have looked at this, the ESMA disclosure reports, and found that some communities are finding these helpful as a way to compare what are proponents offering to other communities, especially if it's a similar type of development. It helps create a baseline and a mutual understanding of what's a fair offer. And, you know, for the community and for the shareholders of the company, you actually have information now that you can use to set a baseline. And for a long time, transparency wasn't really desired because of the federal government's clawback provisions. And so, you know, if you've got a government funding being clawed back anytime you earn a profit or receive payments from a company, then there's not a lot of incentive to put that out there or share what you're being offered. And now that transparency is opening up, I think there's going to be more opportunities to collaborate across communities and actually get a consensus around, what are fair deals. So I think it can contribute in that sense.
Super. Terry or Stephen?
I'll leave that with that one. I think Matthew answered that appropriately.
I'm fine with that answer.
Okay, super. Matthew, a quick question for you. Someone has indicated that they've yet to read the report and have a quick inquiry. Does the report provide quantitative data from the research, or is it more focused on the qualitative analysis summary?
Definitely qualitative. All of the data is from semi-structured interviews. And what we tried to do was get to people that were at the center of these transactions, because a lot of time the details are confidential. So we spoke to a number of law firms that handle a lot of different proponents to get a sense of where are the trends generally across these types of agreements. And in the first piece, we do have an appendix with a listing of a couple dozen projects with Indigenous equity involved. So you can use that as a source to see some of the deals and the numbers involved. But mainly our work here was based on interview data.
Super. Thanks, Matthew. Okay, question for our three panelists. How can we move from consultations with Indigenous communities to equity agreements and ownership? Don't fight each other over this one now.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily a graduation or an evolution from consultation to equity discussions and negotiations. I think they're, the responsiveness of communities and the openness of this project sponsor are really how that relationship starts really coming together. The opportunity itself, of course, has to have some reasonably strong, bankable creditworthiness characteristics and be a revenue generating asset, and have something that presents a scenario to First Nations in which they are never worse off. We're looking for neutral or positive outcomes on these opportunities. And so from, I think there, I just define this as I don't think there's really an evolution of the discussions, but there's an evolution of the project readiness and a point at which you may be, as a project sponsor, prepared to identify what the project opportunity is in terms of inclusion and long-term economic impact, and what that means and what is required from a community to take part in that. But building towards that trajectory and always having the transparency of intentions around that is really the nature of what a trust founded negotiation table will be built upon. So projects really do have to evolve quite a bit to have demonstrated viability and be able to begin presenting what a return on equity looks like to First Nations who may be impacted by that project and may be interested in investing once the project is reasonably de-risked, so that there is no downside. But it is on a project by project basis. Those are some sort of, order of magnitude fundamentals of the evolution of the discussion. But it's again, it is not a one size fits all approach. Many projects impact several communities, and in that event, my recommendation would be to be inclusive, to make sure that they have an opportunity to collectively have discussions with the project sponsors, and there is not an approach where there are silos between each other.
Thanks, Stephen. Terry?
I'll just add to what Stephen, I agree with Steve. Like, it's not, I don't know if there's a spectrum in here, but I think there's a choice is what there is. So, I think from a community perspective is the choice of, do you want to go down this line and do equity participation for the benefit of your community, or do you not, right? Or do you want to have some other form of this? It always reminds me of a meeting I had with the chief up in the Yukon, right? And there was a lot of mining at the time that was going around his community, and they said, we don't want to be, we're not against business development. He said, but we want to be part of it, and we want to be able to use the land thereafter. So to me, what he was saying, it's still got to be consistent with our Indigenous values and beliefs. So, it comes down again to that idea of autonomous decision making. So as a community, is this a choice that they want to do? And I think for smaller communities, it's an opportunity to, partner with other communities to take on these bigger deals as well, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be solely by themselves, right? Or even the larger communities and so forth. So again, I think I don't think it's graduated either. It comes down to a choice.
Thank you, Terry. Matthew, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think a lot of what we hear it comes down to is capacity building for the community and putting them in a position where they can be proactive and potentially even co-design these projects. I've heard the project that follows this one is right now we're reaching out to groups about finance and management capacity specifically. And, we've heard from some nations that they're over consulted at this point because they have hundreds of requests from industry and they have no staff that are really funded to actually deal with all these requests. The government wants to fund on a project to project basis and funds more of a reaction to a plan that's brought to a community. And it's not really considering that, having a funded position, a finance person who can actually deal with the many projects. So yeah, funding that's kind of not missing the forest for the trees. There's so many opportunities that are kind of getting overwhelming some communities in a lot of cases. And because a lot of funding is project based, they're cobbling together the admin portion of different projects to try and get a staff person in who can handle the finance side of things, and they get pulled into HR duties as well. And to now ESG is falling on finance staff. It's difficult to be proactive, and that's, I think, where government funding needs to adjust and put more communities in the driver's seat and in the space where they could actually co-design and design projects their way.
Okay, here's a question that lots of communities across Canada would like an answer to, not just Indigenous. Are you able to speak about ensuring Indigenous communities have access to broadband and internet to ensure their business is successfully set up? You see, I told you it was across Canada. It wasn't. It's a tough one. Anybody have any insight on this?
It's a very challenging one. The number of organizations or the components of broadband and fiber projects that have to come together to make a project successful is they're pretty significant. They're particularly the last mile. There are a number of projects that have, like Mackenzie Valley Fiber Link, that have been successfully driven through by political will, essentially, into communities that reasonably have density and service providers who can take that backbone of fiber connection and then do that last mile and connect every house along the grid and make a reasonable business case for providing that service. But that's challenging to get that last mile solution in there if we're really looking at broadband and fiber. Whereas in the last couple of years with satellite solutions becoming more prominent and available and reliable, that business case is becoming a little bit weaker in some cases, because it is really expensive to channel fiber over hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers. So okay, I don't have an answer there, but to acknowledge that's a challenge.
I've got a couple more questions. I want to get them in, so I'm just going to ask one of you just to answer the next one. In the project planning process, how will the Conference Board of Canada successfully integrate Indigenous knowledge to ensure equitable decision-making powers and equity co-investing goals are prioritized? Matthew?
How to integrate Indigenous knowledge into major project design. In the second piece in the series, we look at the Northern Territories, the co-management boards that they've set up. Those are really good examples of how traditional knowledge is being treated now in reference to projects, in particular to the environmental impacts that they could have. The First Nations Governance Institute recently published a paper on First Nations data sovereignty and how this traditional knowledge is controlled and used, and in some cases it might be kept confidential and but otherwise used to guide the project. So there's different ways that that's happening. Gwich'in International published a piece recently on Indigenous led regulatory regimes. That's becoming more common now, where amendments to the Federal Impact Assessment Act allow these Indigenous led regulatory regimes to actually give a yes or no to a project. And often we've seen if there's a yes, they're also going to be taking equity in that project. There's examples out there of specific projects where that's happening. It's the Haisla First Nation I'm thinking of that did recently had an arrangement for a gold, a silver mine where they were the regulator and then through to the owner and able to incorporate knowledge throughout. So I would encourage you to look at those Northern co-management boards for their guidelines and look at these recent Indigenous-led reviews as well.
All right. And Terry, one question to you. Is there a role for AFOA Canada to provide the capacity for Indigenous groups to assess and assemble necessary financing?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting back to our project financing certification, right? I mean, there's a component in there that kind of speaks to that. I think it's probably something that we can broaden out in time. I mean, we'd have to, certainly partner with some of our other sister institutions on something like that. But I think it does, there is a role for AFOA Canada play in that field. Getting back to I think the little bit of the earlier conversation with Matthew, I think I think this lends itself to further research what the individual previously was talking about. And I think in some of the presentations that Matthew and Steve and Adam have done previously, they've talked about this idea of active Indigenous partnership. And I think there is an opportunity for the research. Like, how do you unpack that and ensure that there's Indigenous values and beliefs in there, but also what are the different models for this active Indigenous participation, and what does that mean based on the opportunity, based on the governance structures that are there, based on, I think, what the community sort of wants by the size of the opportunity, the size of the community, and that kind of stuff, because there'll be different sort of models on how a community may want to approach it. And I think it's a really good opportunity for further research.
Super, thank you. And Stephen, I've only got 1 minute, but could you answer this question? As government officials, how can we reduce consultation fatigue for communities?
Yeah, I think that having have an agenda, essentially. Just make sure they're meaningful meetings, make sure they have an ask and an outcome, and it's not just meetings for meetings' sake, because that often happens and it drives to conclusions that are sort of not really action oriented. So I would say that that's probably one of the major influences that I've seen is keeping negotiations or consultations be meaningful, and certainly having opportunities for them to be community consultations, like open house community consultations, so that the leadership doesn't always have to be sharing information up and down, that the community can come and ask their questions and have full trust in what their leadership is sharing.
Super.
And just one final point, if I may, on future research and how to tie this in.
Yeah.
We touched very briefly on the Indian Act, Matt and Matthew, in your introduction, and the pros and cons of what exists in the Indian Act, and how that holds some communities back, and particularly in relation to land ownership and ability to leverage assets.
Super.
That might be an option.
We had about 150 people join us from across Canada, and this has been very informative for me. So please join me in thanking our guests and our speakers. We really appreciate it. And to get more information on this, you can check out IPAC Connects in our June edition. We'll have a story about this particular session, and we'll also reference the future research that the conference board is considering. So please join me again in thanking Terry, Stephen, and Matthew. We really appreciate it. And to Susan, thank you very much, Susan, for your support and your partnership with the Conference Board of Canada. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.